A while ago, I came across this Twitter post claiming that the phrase "sweet summer child" was invented entirely by Game of Thrones. According to this, nobody has ever used that term before Game of Thrones, and if you remember otherwise, then you are wrong. And I was pretty surprised to read that because, of course, I've heard the phrase "sweet summer child," right? It's a kind of mildly condescending term that you might use to refer to somebody who is naive and inexperienced with the world. Like, "Oh, my sweet summer child, you think Mrs. Johnson's class is gonna be easy? Whew, just you wait." Or, "Hey, you just got a job at a restaurant and you thought you were actually gonna leave when your shift was scheduled to end? My sweet summer child." Like, if you spent any time on the internet at all, then you've probably seen this term. Like, I've even got people saying it in my YouTube comments. And so it was pretty shocking for me to see someone genuinely trying to argue that the saying originated from Game of Thrones. Especially because me personally, I've never read any of the books, I've never watched any of the shows. Like, I had no idea that "sweet summer child" was even in Game of Thrones at all, let alone that it might have invented it. And so I just started reading through that thread, and I very quickly learned that a lot of people disagree quite strongly with this claim. Lots and lots of people are absolutely adamant that they remember hearing and saying "sweet summer child" long before Game of Thrones ever made the phrase popular. And what's more, the debate on this topic stretches way, way, way beyond just this one Twitter post too. Like, I found about 1 billion other Twitter threads and Reddit posts and forum arguments and all sorts of other discussions on this exact topic. Did Game of Thrones invent "sweet summer child"? Let's find out. Okay, so I want to start things off with this graph here because this is typically the prime piece of evidence that people point to when they want to argue that Game of Thrones invented "sweet summer child." This is a graph showing the usage of the term across the 40 million books that are currently archived on the internet by Google. As you can see, there is a huge, gigantic spike after 2011, which is the same year that "sweet summer child" was first said in an episode of Game of Thrones. I think that this graph demonstrates pretty convincingly that even if Game of Thrones didn't invent the phrase, they absolutely popularized it at the very least. Like, this gigantic explosion in usage here is just way too much to ignore. Especially because if we look at this other graph of Google search popularity, then we can see the exact same trend, a huge boost after the episode came out in 2011. And by the way, it's also worth noting that although the Game of Thrones episode that says "sweet summer child" came out in 2011, George R.R. Martin, the creator of the series, actually first used that term in the books all the way back in 1996. That's why we have a smaller little jump in the mid-90s. So at first glance, this graph might seem to just immediately be a discussion ender, right? Like, how can you possibly argue with those numbers? There is a huge, massive, unignorable spike after Game of Thrones came out, so clearly Game of Thrones invented the figure of speech, right? But of course, it's not that simple. Like, there is a counter argument to this graph. Pretty consistently, whenever anybody tries to wield this graph as their weapon in the war for "sweet summer child," out pops the shield of this poem from 1850. "The Creole" by Mary S. Whitaker, plain as day, uses the phrase "sweet summer child" right there almost 150 years before George R.R. Martin ever put it in his books. And so there we go. Argument over, right? Game of Thrones did not invent the figure of speech, and in fact, if we look at that graph again, there's actually more than just one instance of the term popping up way back in the day, so case closed, the saying is not from Game of Thrones. But again, it's just not that simple. All this poem proves is that George R.R. Martin was not the first person to arrange those three words in that specific order. Yes, somebody has used the term "sweet summer child" before Game of Thrones. But that does not automatically mean the Game of Thrones did not invent the specific usage of the phrase that we see today. Like, for example, there's a character in Star Wars named Chewbacca, right? And there's no way that anybody would ever dispute the fact that Star Wars invented that character, right? And even if I show you this newspaper article from 1924 that uses the word Chewbacca, you're still not going to change your mind about that, because Star Wars and this article are both clearly using the word in entirely different fashions. Star Wars uses it as the name of a character, and this article uses it as a kind of like nonsense slang term for chewing tobacco. Like, clearly you cannot just type the word Chewbacca into an archive site and then the second that anything pops up, that's just automatically evidence that Star Wars did not come up with the character. Now, I will admit though, this is kind of a dumb example. Like, there's a big difference between the name of a character and a three-word figure of speech, right? But still, that being said, the fundamental thought is still the same in both of these cases. The specific claim that we're trying to answer here is that Game of Thrones invented sweet summer child as a term for a naive person. Not the Game of Thrones was the first time in the history of the written human English language that somebody put the words sweet, summer, and child in that order. Like today, anytime anybody calls someone else a sweet summer child, they are specifically calling them like wide-eyed and inexperienced and unaware of some crucial bit of knowledge or life experience, which is also exactly the same way that George R.R. Martin used the term in the books. In the original book from 1996, a child says that they like scary stories, and an older woman interjects and says, "Oh, you sweet summer child, what do you know about fear? You have not experienced winter yet. You do not know true fear until you have seen the winter." And the reason that that old woman says that is because in the Game of Thrones world, the seasons of winter and summer both last for multiple years. Like, the winter in Game of Thrones is brutally long and brutally tough, so the old lady is literally calling the boy a sweet summer child because he has only ever experienced summer. He is naive about the long winters and the fear that comes with it, and so thus he is a sweet summer child. And so that is the usage that we need to be looking for when we examine historical instances of the phrase. Sweet summer child is explicitly a figure of speech about naivety and a lack of understanding. That is specifically how it is meant when people say it today, and it's also how George R.R. Martin meant it back in 1996. And so, if we want to prove that Game of Thrones did not invent the expression, our historical example also has to use the phrase in that very same manner. So how about we quit wasting time and start diving into those examples? Let's go through every single instance of somebody saying sweet summer child that I could find and see if any of them match up to the modern usage of the term. All right, so to kick things off, the very first thing that I want to do is talk about this paragraph that you can find on yourdictionary.com. Mostly because this is probably the single most commonly cited piece of evidence by those that don't believe in the Game of Thrones invention theory. This is one of the very first things that pop up when you Google sweet summer child, and so it gets quoted all the time during these internet debates. What this article says is that sweet summer child emerged during the Victorian era as a description for a naive person, and then the paragraph goes on to cite a few examples. And that sounds pretty convincing, right? Like, if you read through those Twitter threads and Reddit posts and all the stuff that I was talking about earlier, people are constantly posting screenshots of this article as their trump card in the argument. Like, this person says, literally the first thing that comes up when you Google it, and then they post a picture of the article. Or here's somebody linking the article as their evidence in a Reddit debate on the topic. And here's somebody posting the article and saying, easily debunked. And here's someone just posting the screenshot and saying, LOL. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at that article since it's being used so often as evidence. Now, right off the bat, the first thing that I want to point out here is that yourdictionary.com is actually quoting Wiktionary here. This is not an original paragraph, which is kind of interesting because Wiktionary has since completely redone their article on Sweet Summer Child. Nowadays, the Wiktionary entry says something completely different. So yourdictionary.com is citing something here that the original source does not seem to stand by. But putting that aside, the only part of this article that really matters for us are these three supposed examples of Sweet Summer Child being used in literature before Game of Thrones. If any of these three are genuine uses of the phrase in specific reference to someone being naive, then that's kind of that, like the argument's sort of over. So let's go ahead and check these out, starting with The Creole by Mary Whitaker, which does indeed say Sweet Summer Child all the way back in 1850. This is that poem that we were talking about earlier that does seem to refute the idea that Game of Thrones came up with the phrase. The problem, though, is that this passage is referring to the summer breeze as Sweet Summer's child. Blue was the summer air and mild, the fragrant breeze, sweet summer's child. It is not referring to a person, and it certainly is not supposed to imply naivety. In this instance, the wind is Sweet Summer's child. Clearly, this has nothing to do with how we use the term today. So let's go ahead and move on to the next example. James Staunton Babcock in The West Wind says Sweet Summer Child back in 1849. But again, the term here is used to specifically describe the wind. Like the poem is literally called The West Wind, and it's all about the summer wind, like blowing corn stalks around and soothing the fever of a sick man. And there's absolutely no reference whatsoever here to anybody being called Sweet Summer Child because they're being naive. The sweet summer child of light and air is the wind. The whole poem is describing the wind. Again, this has nothing to do with the modern usage of the phrase. Now, before we move on to the last example cited in the article here, I do want to encourage you to go ahead and read all these works on your own and decide for yourself if you agree with me here. Because in this video, I am simply presenting you with information and telling you what I think about it. You know, I don't want to tell you what to think, just what I think. I believe both of these poems are very obviously talking about the wind, but if you have a different interpretation, I would love to hear it. That's kind of what makes this stuff fun to dive into. Anyway though, the last example from this article is the work of Frederica Bremer in 1840. Interestingly, this is the only one of the three examples that does not also specify the title of the work. And I think that is because there actually isn't one. I'm fairly certain that this is either an entirely made-up example or it's just very, very badly misattributed. Frederica Bremer was a Swedish writer, and as far as I can tell, the only thing that she published in 1840 was a story called Trollenan, and absolutely Trollenan does not say Sweet Summer Child anywhere in it. I did find the phrase summer child in another one of her works, but that's something we'll talk about later. For now, we are looking specifically for Sweet Summer Child, and that phrase just flat out does not show up in her books. And so there we go. In my opinion, none of the three examples given on this webpage adequately prove that Sweet Summer Child was a term for a naive person before it was used in Game of Thrones. Two of the examples are very specifically referring to the wind and have nothing to do with naivety or inexperience, and the third example probably just does not exist at all. But why should we stop there, right? Because like the whole gimmick of my channel is digging around in old newspapers and stuff, so I went ahead and I did a whole bunch of searching on my own, and now I am ready to present to you every single instance of Sweet Summer Child that I could find from prior to 1996. Let's hit it. All right, so in chronological order, the first two appearances of Sweet Summer Child, as far as I can tell, are actually those two wind poems that we talked about already. One from 1849 and one from 1850. So if we go ahead and skip over those, then the next instance comes to us in 1865, where an author named Meta Lander is dedicating a book to My Sweet Summer Child. And this one is pretty tough to interrogate. There's really no clue at all here as to what Sweet Summer Child is supposed to mean in this context, but at least we are definitely talking about a person this time. I think you would be pretty hard-pressed to claim that this is some kind of conclusive evidence that the phrase as we know it predates Game of Thrones, though. Like, I don't know why anyone would ever want to call their child naive in the dedication to their book. Especially because in that same dedication, the author also says that they hope that the book will remind their daughter of her sunny girlhood, which kind of makes me think that this is supposed to be a reference to literal summer, like summer child as in a child in the sunny summer. The bottom line, though, is that this one does prove that somebody did call somebody else Sweet Summer Child before Game of Thrones. So this is a little bit closer than the poems we were talking about earlier. Whether they were specifically referring to naivety, though, is pretty impossible to glean from just these few words. And in my personal opinion, I think it is very unlikely that that's what the author meant here anyway. Like, this one just, to me, doesn't really prove anything one way or another. Next up is a chapter from a story called Letty's Pathway that I found published in an 1866 edition of the Boston Recorder. In this story, a new mother is just kind of gushing over how much she loves her newborn daughter. And she's saying, "Oh, isn't she just darling? She's so precious. She's so lovely and beautiful. My sweet summer child." So again, at the very least, we have an actual human being here being referred to as a sweet summer child. But just like with the last entry, though, I don't really think this fits the bill. Today, when people use the phrase sweet summer child, it is very clearly meant to be a remark about how someone is sheltered and they don't really understand what they're talking about, and there's even a sort of like mild hint of condescension mixed in there. And that is just really not how you would talk to a newborn baby that you think is the most beautiful, wonderful thing in the world. Like, that's not how George R.R. Martin used the phrase, and it's not at all how anyone uses it today. If anything, this newspaper clipping might show that sweet summer child could have been like some kind of term of endearment, but it doesn't prove at all that it was a reference to naivety. Next up, we have a very sad little poem printed in a newspaper from 1879. This is sort of like a dedication to a newborn child that unfortunately passed away at a very young age. In this poem, the author says that God took away their daughter, their sweet summer child. And I think that this is basically the same thing as the last two examples. Like, this feels much, much more like an explicit term of endearment meant in a positive and uplifting way, whereas the modern use of the term is absolutely not supposed to be a compliment. Like, admittedly, it's pretty much impossible to say objectively what the implication of sweet summer child is supposed to be here, but you would have a pretty hard time convincing me that the author wanted to call their deceased months-old child naive in a dedication poem to their life. Moving along, next is another poem from 1888 that is basically the exact same poem as the last one, just with the name of the child swapped out and like a few small changes here and there. I'm pretty sure that this is somebody just blatantly plagiarizing that last poet and just vaguely changing a couple things, so there's no need to really talk about this one. It's the same exact thing as the last poem. Next up, we got Vine by M.A. MacDonald, published in this particular book in 1889. This one is very simple. Sweet Summer Child is referring to a vine, just like the title of the poem. The whole thing is about a vine, and that's what the phrase is referring to. This is absolutely not a reference to a person, has nothing to do with anybody being naive. All right, the next one I want to talk about is To June by Reynos H. Richards. My audio glitched when I was talking about this poem, so I got to re-record the section on it right here. So this particular poem is kind of interesting. It seems to be personifying the month of June and talking about how wonderful it is. If you wanted to, you could argue that the author is actually literally referring to a person named June, but even then, there's no hint of naivety at all in this poem. And I also found a couple of newspaper articles talking about this poem where they are interpreting it as talking about the month of June and not talking about a person. And that's exactly how I read the poem too. But either way, whether it's talking about the month or a person, this does not seem to have anything to do with the modern usage of the phrase. Next up, we got a poem that a student sent into her local newspaper back in 1938. This poem is about the transition between summer and fall, and the author refers to the summer as Sweet Summer Child and the autumn as Autumn Child. And so pretty unambiguously, this is again not talking about a person. This has nothing to do with how we use the phrase today. And then in 1970, I found a very interesting little example. This is a scan of a newspaper from Pennsylvania, another poem that is unfortunately kind of cut off, although I do think you can kind of get the gist of what's going on here. As far as I can tell, each of these 4 stanzas are all referring to the experience of a child in one of the 4 seasons. Like, here's what the child did in winter, and here's what the child did in fall, and then they refer to the kid as Sweet Summer Child because they are literally a child in the summer. So again, there's no real implication of naivety or ignorance or anything like that here. I do want to point out though that this poem ends by asking the child to try and hold on to the wonderment of their first year, which is kind of a loose connection to how we use the phrase, but still, nobody today ever says Sweet Summer Child to refer to anything like the beauty of a literal baby learning about the natural world. Like in this poem, Sweet Summer Child is very, very explicitly a positive, heartwarming, uplifting phrase. And that's just not at all how we use it today. Like, remember in Game of Thrones, it's said by an old woman who is kind of scoffing at a boy for saying that he likes scary stories when he has never yet experienced anything scary in his life. So I don't think that is at all similar to how this poem is saying Sweet Summer Child, especially because, again, in this instance, the poem is also talking literally about a child in the summer. And that is it. That is every single appearance of Sweet Summer Child that I could find prior to Game of Thrones in 1996. If you, the viewer, can find any other instance of that phrase appearing in literally anything before 1996, then please leave me a comment, send me an email. I would genuinely love to hear about it, because right now we have pretty slim pickings to analyze. In the hundreds of years preceding Game of Thrones, we have a tiny handful of Sweet Summer Child sightings, and basically none of them feel all that analogous to how we use the term today. In my opinion, I think that poem from 1970 and the dedication poem from 1879 are the closest, but even those feel like pretty big stretches to me. Neither of them feels really all that close to the modern figure of speech. But hey, before we hit our conclusion, I do have one last interesting little tidbit to reveal to you. Do you remember earlier when I said that Swedish author, Fredrika Bremer, never said Sweet Summer Child, but she did say just Summer Child? Well, she wasn't the only one. There are tons and tons of instances of people saying just Summer Child all throughout written history. The overwhelming majority of these are people either talking about summer child care or literally talking about a child being born in the summer. But still, even then, hidden amongst those thousands and thousands of mostly literal uses is this one collection of stories from 1850 that kind of blows things open just a little bit. This one is important, so I'm just going to go ahead and read this short passage to you verbatim. Charlotte was Mrs. Leonard's summer child, born in affluence, nourished by the genial sun of love, and now was her only stay and comfort in the dark hours of adversity. But Charlie and Fanny, the sweet twins, were the children of poverty and sorrow, baptized in tears, but not the less dear to the heart of the mother. And that is far and away the closest that we have ever gotten to the way that Game of Thrones uses sweet summer child. The author here is referring to a child who was born during good times as a summer child, which is pretty dang similar to what George R.R. Martin says. But still, this is not quite the slam dunk that you might think at first glance. Mostly because there was actually one more usage of the phrase summer child that was floating around at the same time that this story was written. I found a ton of old books where summer child essentially just means happy, positive, easygoing child that everyone likes. Like, for example, here's a child in a book from 1869 who is the embodiment of fun. So he is a summer child. And here is somebody saying that they were born for rejoicing. They are a summer child. And this kid from 1873, who has been happy for all her life, is a summer child because she is so happy. And in this story, a boy named Rob is his mother's darling, a delight of the whole household, a summer child. This one, I think, is especially important because it also says that Rob is very wise, which is kind of the exact opposite of naive, right? Like, I cannot stress to you enough how common it was in the 19th century for summer child to very explicitly mean a happy, bright, cheerful, positive, lights up the whole room, whole beautiful, wonderful child, right? Like, very specifically, that's what the phrase meant in the 1800s. Okay, so real quick, I gotta jump back in here because I just came across something that's super duper important. So while I've been editing this video, I've also been like continuing to do research on the side, right? And I've especially been looking into this whole thing about what summer child meant in the 1800s. And I only just started to notice that the earliest example that I can find where summer child means like beautiful, kind, nice child is actually from Fredrika Bremer, the Swedish author who sent us down this tangent in the first place. Like, in the story that she wrote in 1843, she uses summer child throughout the entire book to refer to an incredible child who can do no wrong. Like the mother's favorite child, this cheery, positive, perfect, virtuous, noble child who's gonna grow up and do great things and be so nice to everybody, right? And Bremer is like super thorough and so explicit about this specific definition of summer child that I started thinking to myself, did she invent the phrase? Like, she said it before anybody else, as far as I can tell, and she's taking such great care to define it as this one specific thing. And so I just started poking around with that thought in mind, and I found a ton of super convincing stuff. Like, check this out. Here's a newspaper article from 1947 that says, Hetty had been the mother's darling, the summer child, as Fredrika Bremer would say. Like, pretty crazy, right? Like, and here we have a book where somebody is again specifically attributing the term to Bremer. And here's a poem that somebody wrote that's titled Summer Child, and then there's an asterisk that specifies that the term should be attributed to Fredrika Bremer. Like, at this point, I am feeling pretty close to 100% convinced that Frederica Bremer invented the term summer child to refer to a perfect, wonderful, upstanding child, and then other authors also started to use that term to refer to the same thing. Like, this one newspaper clipping in particular is pretty much just about as rock solid as you can get. Like, summer child in this article means mother's darling child, and also Frederica Bremer came up with that. And what's more, I actually think that this directly relates to all those poems that we were talking about earlier where people are saying sweet summer child. Like doesn't Frederica Bremer's definition of summer child just like slot perfectly into those poems? Like, of course, in your dedication poem to your deceased child, you want to be referring to them as this like wonderful, perfect child, exactly like how Frederica Bremer uses the term. And of course, a new mother who's gushing over their newborn baby, when they say summer child, it probably means the exact same sense that Bremer uses the phrase. And so I think a lot of these occurrences of sweet summer child are actually just people using the term summer child, and then they just so happen to attach the word sweet to the front of the already well-known expression that Bremer came up with. Like, look at that book dedication from the 1860s again. Summer child is in quotation marks, but sweet is not. I think there's a reason for that. Like, the fact that these sources say sweet summer child may at first glance make it seem like they're related to the Game of Thrones usage of the phrase, but in actuality, they probably aren't. Instead, they're probably related to the Frederica Bremer usage of the term. When it's said in Game of Thrones, it means naive. When it's said by Frederica Bremer, it means wonderful and kind. This is some pretty cool stuff, if you ask me. And so, in my opinion, it is that definition of summer child that is being used in this book. Charlotte is her mother's summer child because she is this bright, positive presence in her life, which the passage also literally just says right there. Charlotte is the one bright spot in her mother's life. Charlotte, being born in affluence, I don't think is necessarily supposed to imply that she is naive. Instead, it's supposed to explain why she is the happy, upbeat summer child. Like, I don't think the author intended you to read this and think, oh, so Charlotte is inexperienced with the world. Charlotte is naive. You're supposed to read this and think, oh, Charlotte is the really cheery, upbeat person that keeps her mother going during hardship. Especially because, as we've seen, there are a lot of examples of summer child specifically meaning happy, popular child, and basically none that I could find where it clearly means naive child. But I'm not really all that concerned with just summer child anyway. The specific expression that people say today is sweet summer child, and there are tons of people all over the internet that say that they remember saying or hearing specifically sweet summer child before Game of Thrones. So the big question, the title of this video is, did Game of Thrones invent the specific phrase sweet summer child as a figure of speech that refers to a naive person? And at least for now, my very, very soft answer to that question is yes. Yes, that specific three-word phrase used in that specific manner is from Game of Thrones. And if you disagree with me, then prove me wrong, please. Like, I would love to basically issue like an open challenge here. Like, see if you can find a single, clear-cut, obvious instance of anybody ever using sweet summer child to refer to a naive person before 1996. Like, I would love to hear about it. I would love to be proven wrong. I would love for there to be one more little wrinkle in this story. Like, I am not at all positive about this. It's not like I'm some master historical researcher or anything. Like, I'm just a guy who thinks this stuff is fun to talk about. So if someone wants to kind of take the reins from me and just like decimate my whole argument, then by all means, the floor is yours. But trust me, when I tell you that it's gonna be tough. Because as one last little piece of evidence, I wanna go back to that graph. You know, the one from the beginning of the video, the one that shows how often Sweet Summer Child shows up in Google's book archive. Why don't we pop a few other common expressions in there instead of Sweet Summer Child, such as bless your heart, which is very commonly distributed across the last couple centuries, or too big for his britches, or hotter than blazes, or pretty as a peach, or early bird gets the worm, or hold your horses, or raining cats and dogs. Like, I very much encourage you to pull up this website and try this out for yourself. Plug in like pretty much any old saying that is at least somewhat well known by the general population, and I can pretty much guarantee you that you're gonna get a good amount of hits before the last few years. Like, my question is, if Sweet Summer Child is actually this very old, very antiquated expression, then why is it the only one that has a graph like this? Like, I know that Google doesn't have every single book ever written, but still, this is millions and millions of books that we're searching through here. Like, why does every other figure of speech that you can think of have at least some representation except for Sweet Summer Child? Like, there are tons and tons and tons of people out there who are very, very sure that they used or heard this phrase before Game of Thrones. So you'd think there'd be at least something, right? Like, I could believe this whole story that it predates Game of Thrones if this phrase was supposed to have come from like some very small, isolated community, only a small amount of people remember it, but no, people from all over the country, from Utah, from Ohio, from the South, they all supposedly remember people saying Sweet Summer Child, but nobody ever wrote it down, ever. Like, this is supposedly a phrase that spanned the entire United States. People from all over, from all walks of life used to say it, but nobody ever put it to paper in the same way that we use the phrase today, ever. But hey, all that being said, again, I'm really not trying to tell you what to think here. Like, I don't want to come off like I'm condescending to you if you really believe you heard this phrase. Like, if you are watching this and you are still genuinely positive that you remember people saying Sweet Summer Child before 1996, then maybe you did. Like, I'm not going to tell you that you didn't. It's entirely possible you did. But if that's the case, then I just flat out refuse to believe that nobody ever once ever wrote it down anywhere. Way too many people remember it for that to be the case. Like, there just has to be a letter that somebody wrote, or a newspaper article, or a book, or a song lyric, or even somebody saying it in an interview, because our cutoff here is 1996. Like, video had been around forever before then. Like, there just has to be at least one smoking gun. And maybe you're gonna be the one to go and find it. I think that would be pretty cool. This is kind of exciting. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.